In 1936, Stanley Unwin received a manuscript for a children's book. He decided to give it to his son Rayner to write a report about whether or not he should publish it. And after reading it, Rayner wrote this: Bilbo Baggins was a hobbit who lived in his hobbit hole and never went for adventures. At last, Gandalf the wizard and his dwarves persuaded him to go. He had a very exciting time fighting goblins and wargs. At last they got to the Lonely Mountain. Smaug the dragon, who guards it, is killed, and after a terrific battle with the goblins, he returned home rich. This book, with the help of maps, does not need any illustrations and is good and should appeal to all children between the ages of 5 and 9. It was because of Rayner's recommendation that they published The Hobbit. And many years later, while he was on vacation, Stanley received a letter from Rayner, who is now an adult, saying that the sequel to The Hobbit had finally arrived. It was much longer than they could have anticipated, more mature than they expected, but it was a work of genius and they should absolutely publish it. Stanley wrote back and said, if you can publish it and lose no more than £1,000, you have my blessing. And when he finally returned from his vacation and read the manuscript himself, he said it was a book for all time, which will be selling long after my departure from this world. With over 150 million copies sold to date, The Lord of the Rings has certainly outlived its publisher.
Every human being, across all time and space, we've been hardwired for stories.
There are no breaks in this business. You make your breaks.
The reason I'm in this room right now is because my music's very dope.
Let's try to find something that people remember 20 years later.
Break rules. Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.
You're only given a little spark of madness. And if you lose that, you're nothing.
To be like the greats, you have to study the greats. And today, we are studying one of the great book publishers of the 20th century, Sir Stanley Unwin. Stanley published some of the greatest authors of the 20th century. Of course, J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, Thor Heyerdahl, who wrote The Kentucky Expedition, Bertrand Russell, Sidney Webb, Mahatma Gandhi. The list goes on. And while he is not an artist himself, I think there are still valuable lessons that creators can learn by studying the people who help bring great creative works to life. Every single episode of Artwell is connected to one that came before it, and obviously we are studying Stanley Unwin today because he published The Lord of the Rings, and we just finished doing episodes on J.R.R. Tolkien. In preparation for today's episode, I read Stanley's memoir, The Truth About a Publisher. This book is no longer in print, and so I had to buy it from a used bookstore in the UK. And I also read the book George Allen and Unwin, which is Rayner Unwin, Stanley's son's memoir about the company. Across these two books, I took 148 highlights, and now I'm very excited to share with you what I learned. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly, and this is Artwell. The Unwins are book people. Long before Stanley became one of the great publishers of the 20th century, his relatives started Unwin Brothers, which was a printing company in the 1800s. His uncle, T. Fisher Unwin, or TFU, had his own publishing company that Stanley went and worked at before leaving and starting his own publishing company, George Allen and Unwin. Rayner, Stanley's son, ended up taking over George Allen and Unwin when Stanley retired, and then Rayner's son, or Stanley's grandson, Merlin, started his own publishing company called Merlin Unwin Books. This is a family who has the book publishing or the book industry running through their veins. And before Stanley started his own company, like I said, he went and worked for his uncle T. Fisher Unwin. And this was invaluable experience for Stanley. And he didn't take over this company. Like, he did help grow it. He was an integral piece of that company, and he started working there when he was only a teenager. But eventually got to a point where he felt like he wasn't actually going to be T. Fisher Unwin's successor, at least not anytime soon. And so he made the decision to leave and buy his own company. But part of the reason that you could say George Allen and Unwin became so successful was because of all of the lessons that Stanley got learning from his uncle. Like, one of the best ways to learn anything is to go and work for someone who's doing the thing or has the career that you want to have. Because that firsthand experience is something you're not going to be able to replicate reading books, listening to this podcast. You have to go out there and be in the real world. And Stanley Unwin did that. He went and built up his skills working for somebody else, where obviously there's risk and there's things on the line, but not in the same way when it's your own company. And so Stanley was able to go and learn from somebody who was very good at what they did take those lessons and start his own firm. And one of the things that TFU was good at was identifying talent. He could publish great authors early in their career. He would identify them before anybody else could. Some of the people who Stanley said TFU published early work of were people like Joseph Conrad, George Moore, John Galsworthy, H.G. Wells, H.D. Stackpool, W.B. Yeats. As a quick aside, like how many of those names do you recognize? These were like people that Stanley was referring to as like great authors that you probably might not recognize, which is like, maybe don't take this life thing too seriously because like no one's going to remember you anyways, but that's besides the point. The point here is on this idea of CFU was really good at discovering talent, which was a lesson that Stanley was able to learn from him, and Stanley was able to identify talent himself. But one of the things that Stanley also learned from this, as the discoverer of talent is rarely the one who actually reaps the reward. Because what happens is the discoverer of talent identifies somebody who's good but unknown, takes the risk on that person, which is a financial risk that they're taking, which there's a good chance there's going to be little financial outcome for them. They don't earn that much, but they identify this person, they invest in this person, they help develop them. They finally start to have a little bit of success, and then a bigger publisher would swoop in and sign them to a better deal. And I say better deal with quotations, and we're going to talk about why more money isn't always a better deal. But this would happen constantly. Stanley even once said that my firm published 7 volumes of essays and plays by Stefan Zweig, all of which we lost money. We did so confident that one day he would produce something more readily saleable. But when he wrote his first popular book, he was badly in need of dollars and without reference to us, sold the English language rights to an American publisher. The book was successful, and the publisher who secured the British rights, who had at the time done nothing to establish the author's reputation and whose bid included goodwill built up by us, not merely reaped where we had sown, but secured the reputation of being the more effective publisher. The perception from the outside, right? Like when you're looking at where you want to sign, if that is something you're exploring, whether it be management, whether it be a publisher, and you're looking at who the talent is, an important thing to recognize is like, are they really good at identifying talent and nurturing talent, or are they really good at identifying success? And I think those are two really different things and a really important distinction for you as an artist to understand. And I think this might be part of the reason why people get frustrated when artists go mainstream, right? Because the incentives or the reason that somebody identified them in the first place was like because they really loved what they were doing. They thought they were really good at what they were doing, and they wanted to nurture and develop that. Versus later on in their career when they quote unquote sell out or they cash out, what's happening is like, again, that firm, whoever it is, that manager is identifying them for their success and is therefore not going to try and nurture their talent. They're going to try and nurture their success, which is, again, a very different thing. And so one of the important things for you as an artist is to try to pay attention to like, why is this person signing me? Why did they sign the people that they signed? Because you have to maintain a level of purity with your art. And if you are working with somebody who identified you because of the art and not because of the success, they're going to be far more likely to nurture that side of you, to encourage you to do the thing you're good at, instead of to encourage you to do the thing that they think will make the most money. And so again, ultimately, Stanley Unwin made the decision to leave T. Fisher Unwin because he kind of like hit a glass ceiling there where he wasn't going to be succeeding into his uncle's position anytime soon, but he wanted to have his own business. And so he went out and he looked for an asset he could buy, and he found George Allen Publishing. And George Allen Publishing was a decently, again, somewhat not like a huge firm, but decently successful. And then George Allen passed away. The company went to his kids, and then the company fell on hard times. They attempted to merge with another firm. That didn't end up going very well. So they were approaching bankruptcy, and that's when Stanley came in and bought the company. And you might be thinking, wait, he bought a company and he didn't rename it. He just added his name to the end. So it was just George Allen and Unwin Publishing. But condensed, the name is Allen and Unwin. And the reason, according to Rayner, why Stanley did that is because if you would look at a directory of publishing firms, Unwin Publishing would be near the bottom of the list. Allen and Unwin Publishing would be near the top of the list. And so the reason Stanley left it as George Allen and Unwin is because Allen and Unwin would be at the top of the directories. Also, there's something interesting here too about this idea of Stanley purchased the company from the children of the founder of the company. There's like this constant thread of like so many great companies are great because of the visionary person who is like making the thing. And like this, trying to find an appropriate successor is incredibly difficult when you have somebody great who starts the company. And I might be sidebarring on this because I'm foreshadowing something we're going to talk about later, but it is interesting to see this constant thread of like you have a great talent that is unable to find an appropriate successor. And there's like also this sort of like great talent sometimes can't find a way to like properly coach the next wave or like the next coming of people. Like the way you think about it is like from a sports perspective, like Wayne Gretzky, the greatest hockey player of all time, tried to be a coach, was a terrible coach. Michael Jordan can't coach basketball because like the greats are just, they understand things intuitively that the average person just can never understand. And so they get frustrated and they don't understand how to properly coach someone because they just see things, they see the world in a way that's not natural, that they can't just explain to somebody who sees the world in a regular way to see it like them. And so succession planning with companies, with athletes, whatever it is, can be incredibly difficult when you have like a visionary person trying to then coach the next generation. But nonetheless, Stanley Unwin buys this company from George Allen's children, and the day he takes possession is August 4th, 1914. August 4th, 1914 is the day World War I started. In terms of days to start your business, that's got to be one of the worst ones. But the thing is if you can survive during difficult conditions, the good conditions are going to be easy for you. Like Stanley got a letter from an Australian bookseller shortly after he took over the firm. And he said, "It is a great thing to bear your yoke in your youth. If you can stand a knockout blow on the day you start, you will take whatever else comes to you in life with perfect equanimity." Stanley Unwin started his business in difficult times. He ran it during difficult times. He started it in World War I. He then had to run it during World War II while London was being bombed. During World War II, a bomb dropped on one of their warehouses and destroyed 1.4 million books. Gone. Their offices became a bomb shelter because the pillars were reinforced because of the weight of the books. And so it became a bomb shelter. And because of that, people were stealing books. They got bed bugs in their inventory. Like he navigated some incredibly difficult times through his career. But the lesson here is there is no such thing as a good time to start. Whether it be a business, whether it be making things, an Instagram, a TikTok, whatever it might be. Because if you start when things are really, really good, you might have success in the short term. But then when things get hard, you won't have developed the skill set to be able to navigate the downswing. But if you start when things are hard, it's going to be harder to like kind of have that initial inertia and overcome like the starting up of whatever it might be, whether it be an Instagram or a business or art that you're making. But if you can do it, then you can navigate the bad times when they come around again, and you'll be more than capable during the good times. There is no like really true, like this is the right time to start. Like there is no right time, just start the thing. Stanley started his business the day World War I began. And when talking about reflecting on the fact that this is when he started his business, he said the outlook was indeed depressing, but there is no evil out of which some good cannot be extracted if you look for it. I'm going to read that again. There is no evil out of which some good cannot be extracted if you look for it. Our competitors all had capital locked up in autumn lists of publications produced for quite other conditions, like not to be published during a world war. We had no such commitments or preoccupations. We could concentrate our attention upon what the changed circumstances called for. For example, we rushed out Emma Philip Price's Diplomatic History of the War. Austin Harrison hastily produced a bestseller for us entitled The Kaiser's War, and confident that would eventually be wanted, I put in hand a reprint of Kant's Perpetual Peace. A strong belief I have is that the flip side of your greatest weakness is your greatest strength. And I often, when talking about this, cite Mr. Beast as the example. Mr. Beast, of course, everybody knows who he is for the most part, the biggest YouTuber in the world, and your opinion of what he makes I'm not here to discuss what Mr. Beast, what Jimmy makes, but I want to talk about how he found success as a creative person. At the beginning of his career, he had no money. And he was trying to compete with other creators who did have money. Like at the time that Mr. Beast really started to gain traction was when like Logan Paul and Jake Paul and David Dobrik were like doing crazy videos with Lamborghinis and all this stuff in mansions. And Jimmy lived in a small town in South Carolina or North Carolina. He couldn't compete with them financially. Like his biggest weakness was the fact that he had no money. But he had no money because I don't think he even had a job. But that meant he had time. Time was something that the rich people, the successful people didn't have. And so what he did was he identified his unique strength in his weakness. He had no money, but he had time. So he used that time to film videos that people who had more money couldn't film. They didn't have the time to count to 100,000 like he did. To say Logan Paul 100,000 times like he did. But he found the thing that only he could, and his circumstance was uniquely suited for, and doubled down on it. Let the constraints of your situation guide you, not hinder you. No matter what your situation is, your greatest strength is on the flip side of your greatest weakness. There is no evil out of which some good cannot be extracted if you look for it. You have to look for it. Like it's not necessarily obvious. It's much easier to identify the thing that you don't have than the opportunity that you do have. But if you take the time to actually think about what can I do right now? What do I have around me that I can use to my advantage? It's going to be your superpower. This isn't quite the same thing, but this is what Robert Rodriguez did. He wanted to make a movie. His first movie, Mariachi, was made for, I believe, $7,000. And the reason he was able to make it for $7,000 is he was sitting in a room one day and he's like, what do I have? Like, I want to make a movie. What do I have? I have a guitar case. I have a turtle. Or maybe I'll write a movie about a guitar case and a turtle. And he wrote a movie that he could make in his immediate surroundings. That became his strength. He didn't let the constraints of his situation hold him back. He allowed them to guide his process, to guide the film that he ultimately ended up making. There is no such thing as the right time or a good time to do something. There is right now, and that is the best time. No matter what your situation is, you can use that to your advantage. You just have to take some time to figure out and find the way. To find that strength, to find that good. And so I guess you could say that that's one thing that successful people have in common is they don't let their circumstances dictate their level of commitment. They don't wait for the right time. They just go and do the thing. And another thing that they do is they focus. You hear successful people all the time talk about how important focus is. On the second deep dive we did on James Cameron, he has this quote where he says, you can't keep one foot in cabinet making and one foot in directing. You have to be all in. But one thing people don't talk about when it comes to focus is, yes, focus in the beginning is incredibly important. And it's something that this journey I've gone on with Artwell. If you've been listening to the show for a while, it's a little different now than what it used to be. It used to be I would do these deep dives, but then I would follow up the deep dive with interviews. And then I would do these 2-3 essays, and I would put the essays together as a season finale. And it was this bloated show. And I went through 2025. The whole purpose of 2025 was basically getting focused on the core thing of Artwell, and that is these deep dives. I'm not doing anything else. This is my focus. And that's important. I think that's going to be important to the ultimate success of this show is these deep dives and only doing these deep dives. Because whenever somebody would ask me, it's what's your show about? There's no succinct way of explaining it. Now it's just I do deep dives into the creative philosophies of history's greatest artists. Easy to understand. Versus before it was I would do these deep dives and then I follow up interviews and there's just too much there. I needed to streamline it. And part of I'm on a bit of a tangent here, but part of the battle of that is I initially, when I focused, got rid of everything I didn't want to do. But there was a bunch of things that I wanted to do that I kept doing. But the truth about focus is it's not just about eliminating the things you don't want to do. It's actually about eliminating all of the things you do want to do until there's just one thing you want to do left. And that's the hard part. Like getting rid of the stuff you don't want to do to focus is easy. It's getting rid of all the other things you do want to do to focus. But the thing that people don't talk about with focus that often gets overlooked is like, one, in the beginning, yes, incredibly important. But focus becomes harder the more successful you get. Because the more successful you get, the more opportunities that are going to come your way. Like there's this point in the middle that's fine. It's like when you start, you could do anything. And so that's hard to focus because you could do anything. But then once you commit to something and you're all in, no one's going to say anything. Like there's going to be no distractions for a while because like no one knows who you are. But then when people start to know who you are, once you've been focused, they're going to start to offer you things that are going to take you off course. And it is important that you remain focused like to the thing you initially set out to do. Stanley said it is astonishing in life how frequently the most attractive proposals come one's way at the moment when it is impractical to accept them. Within a few months of our start, we were offered, probably at the instigation of Austen Harrison, then editing the English Review, 3 manuscripts which we wanted to accept and would have unhesitatingly accepted 18 months later, but which represented too startling a departure from the then character of our publications to accept at the very outset. So what he's saying here is, if they'd accepted those 3 publications, like this at the outset, it's like relative. It's not like it was like day one. Like again, Austen Harrison was a book they'd published during the First World War. So just a little while after they started again to have some success, they were on the upswing. And so they were being given the opportunity, 3 really good manuscripts. But the timing of doing them wasn't right. And Stanley knew that for the longevity of the firm, they had to focus on what they initially set out to publish. And that's a difficult thing to do, especially like in his case, you get 3 great manuscripts. Or maybe you're a creator, right? And you get an opportunity to go and do a show for somebody else at the detriment of your own show. Once you start to have success is when you're going to start getting opportunities. And one of the most important things you're going to have to do as an artist is navigate those decisions to make the right ones for you and your career. Like one of the decisions, the inflection point that you're going to come to as a creative is how much you're willing to compromise what you're doing for money. Because it's going to come. Like when you have success, someone's going to identify that success and they're going to want to work with you because they think your success is going to make them more money. And that's fine as long as you can maintain control. I guess really the point here is like when you get to that inflection point, like make sure you don't give up your control in what it is that you're making. And don't get rid of a partner who helped you become successful for short-term cash. There was this author that Stanley published. His name was Eric Leadbeater. His first book, Rain Before Seven, was really well received, but the initial manuscript that they got wasn't that great. And so he worked with the readers and the editors at Allen and Unwin to really refine and polish the book. And again, it was well received. They did that 2 more times. They took their time with him. They really developed the work to get to a really good point. Well received, well received. He's starting to get some success. A bigger publisher comes in. They offer him a bigger advance. Eric makes the decision to sign with that other publisher, but they want to rush because they want to capitalize on his success. And so they rush his next book out and it flops. And so there's a couple of lessons in that. One, there's the lesson of upfront money is not everything. And there's 2, this idea of when you become successful, you don't want to take advantage of your success. You want to respect your success, but don't take advantage of it. I guess really what I'm saying is like when you have success, there's a tendency like with what Eric Leadbeater did was like, I just need to get the next book out there because if I get the next book out there, like more people are going to buy it, I'm going to make more money. But because he rushed it and the book flopped, he didn't make as much money as he probably thought he was going to. And now his long-term earning was probably down. But also, again, upfront money isn't always everything. Like Eric Leadbeater signed with this other firm because they gave him a bigger advance. But in doing so, he lost the support and the development that he was getting from Allen and Unwin. And when it came out of this experience, Stanley said, like, this experience also gave me a contempt for the practice of acquiring a competitor's author by outbidding him, a practice I have consistently avoided. I have, on the other hand, more than once secured a book by offering less. I remember one instance when an author brought me the actual offer received from another publisher and asked me whether I would pay more. My reply was, surely you don't expect to get my services as cheaply as you can those of my competitors. My service is outstanding, but it is not cheap. The best is seldom the cheapest. But in all these matters, authors and most agents are wiser than they were 40 years ago and recognize that the amount of the advanced payment is not the only criterion. When the boot is on the other leg and I am selling to an American or foreign publisher, I regard the status and efficiency of the firm as of greater importance than the size of the initial payment. There's far more to a partner than payment. And so you have to be intentional. Again, this is a decision you're going to have to make as an artist. It's like, who do you want to align yourself with? Who do you want to work with? And again, one of the heuristics we talked about earlier is like, how do they find the people they work with? Do they identify talent or do they identify success? That could be one way you evaluate the people you want to work with. But Stanley looks like, what else does that firm bring you? Does that person bring you beyond just the initial money that they're promising you? And really too, like, if one of your core heuristics is like, how much money am I going to make up front? That shows a lack of belief in the long-term potential of your own art. Like, if you think the number one way for you to make money, again, this, as I'm like talking here, I'm like hearing myself, and I'm like, the reason we make things isn't just to make money. Of course not. But if you make something that you truly think is great, and you're allowing money to become part of the equation in how you make your decisions, if you are taking the upfront money, that's short-sighted, yes, but it's also like, again, you're not showing you believe in the thing that you've made. Because if you take less money up front and less money on the back end, like, you're trying to, again, you take more money up front to make less money on the back end, is short term. If you take less money up front to make more money on the back end, you're showing that you believe that you're going to make more money because you think the thing you made is really, really good. And so when you're evaluating the people to work with, pick the people who are going to not allow you to have the most short-term success, but the people who you think are going to be able to help you have the more long-term success, the more sustainable success. Because upfront money is not everything. And another version of this, of like cashing out or chasing money, is like chasing trends. And I just can't reiterate enough, like, how much chasing trends is not going to allow you to build a meaningful body of work. And I think really that's the game here, is like, how can you build a meaningful body of work? And like, my belief I've talked about in the past is that your diehard fans are made in your catalog. They're not made in the most recent thing you put out. So how can you build something meaningful that when someone does discover you, they become a fan and they continue to be a fan with every next thing that you put out? That's what you want to do. You want to create a meaningful body of work. And that doesn't happen if you're just chasing what's popular. And well, again, Stanley's not an artist. The body of work that he was trying to create was like the totality of the books that his firm was publishing. And he said, one of the curious features of the kind of business I was endeavoring to build was the way biographies would dominate the list one year and science or economics other years. It is, of course, partly chance, but fashion comes into it. The public gets deeply interested at one moment, let us say, in currency problems or psychoanalysis, and a flood of books arises on those subjects, many of them second-rate and ephemeral. On such occasions, a publisher who maintains a standard observes books appearing which he has turned down as definitely not good enough. And the trouble is that the second rate spoils the market for the good. So what he's saying here is like, during the, when the hot, whatever the hot thing is or the current thing is, all these books would pop up to try to capitalize on it. And he wouldn't evaluate books. He would see them get published, books that he had already turned down. And why he didn't publish his books, which might even sell and make money, is he knew they weren't great. And so for him, he wasn't evaluating his number one criteria is what isn't popular right now. It was always, how good is this book? And what would ruin the market is when those second-rate publishers wouldn't care about the quality of the book. They would just publish it because it was popular. And ultimately, it would spoil the market. Like, people would stop caring about this thing because so much crap was flooded into it. But this idea that Stanley was not worried about chasing trends. He was more focused on the quality of the work that he was putting out there, even like that he was publishing, is one of the reasons that allowed him to maintain a successful firm for as long as he did. Chasing trends is not how you build a meaningful body of work. And so this was important to Stanley, to publish books that were of a certain quality. He wasn't going to compromise the output of his firm because of what was popular in the current moment. He wasn't just going to pander to public taste. And he really prided himself on not doing that he was going to publish things that were good, that people didn't just want to read right now. They were going to want to read for years and years to come. Like, if he was going to put something out that was in alignment with what was currently popular, it was going to be good enough that when that trend died down, people were still going to read it. And the challenge, though, with wanting to put out books that people are going to want to read in the future is that they might not always want to read them right now. Like, yes, if they're in alignment with a current trend, maybe. But when trying to give people something they don't even know they want yet, there's a good chance they're going to push back on that. But when talking about this, Stanley said, book publishers have to learn that they are not expected to have feelings. As a firm, we prided ourselves on publishing what would interest people tomorrow. In the field of ideas, we wished to lead rather than to follow. Our predecessors had published the first translation of Karl Marx's Capital and the first translation of a work by Freud, The Interpretation of Dreams, which at the time was a courageous thing to do. Few appear to realize the troubles which beset a publisher who is thinking of tomorrow when confronted with officials whose ideas are firmly rooted in the past. It is no new problem. How many of the present generation, I wonder, are aware that before the First World War, a publisher ran grave risks if he even mentioned the existence of venereal diseases in a book intended for the general public? The firm which is thinking all the time of tomorrow rather than yesterday is bound to be met with prejudice. This, yes, of course, he's talking about a publisher, but a publisher is publishing the work of an artist, of an author. And the job of the artist is to go out on the edge of what is known and unknown and take that step into the unknown. The hard thing about that is when you are pushing people outside of their comfort zone with the work that you're making, a lot of people are going to push back initially. The thing is, though, is if you just give people what they want, people will eventually get bored and move on to the next thing. And this is a challenge that Joni Mitchell ran into throughout her career. People kept asking her to just give us another Blue. Give us another, Blue, really. Like, that was her big album. And she had this singer-songwriter sound, Blue, Ladies of the Canyon, Court and Spark. And she started to get more jazzy. And people didn't like that. They just wanted more of the same. But Joni knew if she continued to do that, they were going to get bored with her. So for Joni, it just made more sense. Like, if I'm going to alienate my audience, I'd rather alienate my audience by taking risks and chances and trying to do something new than just giving them more of the same. Because for her, it wasn't exciting to just do more of the same. So she might as well be having fun with what she's doing and taking that risk to give people something new, to take that step, than to just pander to what her audience wanted. Robin Williams did the exact same thing. People expected him to be a certain way, to take certain roles. And for him, that wasn't fun. He started as this zany sitcom guy. And then at the beginning of his career, other than Popeye, which was his first movie role, he took a lot of serious acting roles, and the beginning of Robin's career didn't really go very well. It was critically decently reviewed. Some movies did okay, but none of them were overly super well received. And in that case, it's probably because Robin took the jump And the people pushed back. And so it took Robin a decade, probably until Good Morning Vietnam, I guess, really. And even that's like still a mix of serious with a lot of his comedy. But it took Robin a long time for people to really accept him as a serious artist. They recognized the fact that he was doing that, but they didn't accept him as a serious artist. They still wanted to see him be Mork from Mork and Mindy, the sitcom, and do crazy, zany stuff. And so it takes time if you are going to try and push people outside of their comfort zone. And sometimes what their comfort zone simply is what they expect from you. In the case of Robin Williams or Joni Mitchell, like, it's going to take time. When you push people out of their comfort zone, you're going to get pushback. But again, the thing is, if you just give people what they want, eventually they're not going to want that anymore. And then you're going to be stuck only ever having done one thing. People have moved on and you don't know what to do. And on this, like when it came to publishing books that were quote unquote risky or that people didn't necessarily accept in the moment, Stanley said that had I listened to booksellers' advice, excellent as it is in relation to the past, I should long since have been out of business, because nearly all the books out of which we have made most money, they would have condemned had they been consulted. And I think this is interesting, right? Because so often we think of book publishers or movie producers as like the middlemen of culture. Like they're the people who are in between the artist and the people. Like they're the artists are the ones who create the culture. The people are the people who are the culture. And so there's these business people, the middlemen of culture, as Salvador Dali referred to them. But it's funny to see Stanley Unwin, who most people would view as like a middleman of culture, talking about the booksellers in a way that like an artist would talk about a producer. Like he is saying how like the booksellers as business people were only able to look at their bottom line and see what's working now. Okay, let's do more of that. But Stanley wasn't just trying to think about what is going to work now, because he knows that that's not what's going to keep a sustainable business in the long run. You can't keep giving people what they want. To do this well, to be innovative, to push the culture forward, you can't rest on what you did yesterday. This is Stanley writing this again. The late William Heinemann used to say that a publisher must be something of an accountant and something of a lawyer. Above all, if the imprint of his firm is to be associated with great books, he must have a wide-ranging mind, keeping his finger on all new movements, knowing what the world has appreciated in the past, what it will need and appreciate today, and yet again, what it will be asking for tomorrow. And if you think about it, like with the purpose of Artwell, right? Again, he's talking about you need to appreciate the past, which is absolutely important. You need to understand what came before, but you're not trying to recreate what came before. You have to build upon what came before, understand what people want and need today, and always be looking for that next thing, never resting on the thing you're making now, always looking forward, always pushing beyond. And sometimes when you're an artist and you have a really innovative idea, it's not going to be well received by the public. Again, like we've talked about. But sometimes the reason it's not well received is because you're not giving it a chance to be received. Like, I think that there's value to editorial help and getting feedback in the process. Like I think there's a way where you can become too into the art that you stop thinking about the audience. And I'm not saying the audience should guide necessarily what you make, but they should influence parts of how you make it. Like in the Tolkien episode, we talked about how J.R.R. Tolkien, if you had let him just write a book purely for himself, exactly how he wanted to write it, he would have written the book in Elvish, not in English, in a fake language that he created that nobody else could read. If he does that, The Lord of the Rings does not sell 150 million plus copies since its publication. It's probably read by like one person, and that's J.R.R. Tolkien, because he's the only one who knew how to read it. But because he made some editorial decisions that considered the audience, he made changes to the work so that the audience could accept it. Like you need to make this thing in a way that the audience can actually receive it. They still might not be happy receiving it. There still may be pushback, but you're at least giving your art a chance. Feedback in the process is important. If we circle back to Eric Leadbeater, that author who, again, I talked about how he published 3 books with Stanley, and the first book was Rain Before Seven. And here's how Stanley described the process. It had been declined, this book, Rain Before Seven, had been declined by 10 or 12 publishers, but our readers thought it showed promise. We persuaded the author to put a good deal more work into it, as a result of which it was greatly improved. Although the sales remained modest, its reception was almost startlingly good. After the publication of a later novel, of which at our suggestion he had also put in a good deal of additional work, an enthusiastic reviewer described the author as a second Thomas Hardy. Feedback in the process is important. It is important. But there's a couple of notes. I guess one thing is it's crucial is like when you think about a game, or everything was something like God of War, which again we've done an episode, we did 2 episodes on God of War. If you're listening to this, I assume you're not necessarily a God of War fan, but God of War I studied them because they put out some of the highest rated video games on 4 consoles over the course of like 20 years. God of War 1 and 2 are some of the highest rated video games on the PlayStation 2. God of War 3 is one of the highest rated video games on the PlayStation 3. God of War Chains of Olympus and Ghost of Sparta, 2 of the highest rated games on the PSP. God of War 2018, one of the highest rated games on the PS4. God of War Ragnarok, one of the highest rated games on the PS5. Like there is this consistent greatness that comes out of this studio. And I needed to know why. And one of the things that every single director, because they had a different director for every game, which makes the fact that they have done this even more impressive. And one of the things that every single director in this franchise stressed was the importance of playtesting, bringing people into the studio to try their game, to find ways to break it, to play and see how the real people react when actually playing the game. Because the truth is, like, your ideas don't always hold up against reality in the way you think they will. And so by getting outside perspective on your art, it is going to allow you to make changes you could never see on your own that makes it more receptive to the public. Now, some additional thoughts on this. One, I have three thoughts. One of them is actually God of War related. One of the things when it comes to God of War, Cory Barlog, who directed God of War 2 in 2005 and directed God of War in 2018, the reboot sequel, talked about how when it comes to intaking feedback, you're not looking for feedback that is going to change things aesthetically or on personal taste. Like anything where someone's like, this is cool, but I wish this thing was red and not blue, like that doesn't matter. That is a matter of personal taste. And his personal taste is going to be one of the guiding lights of this game. So he's not looking to change things that changes the thing he's trying to say. What he will change is if there's something in the game that breaks the experience and gets in the way of the person receiving the experience he wants them to have. Like if the feedback is on the experience or the story, like he's not going to change the story because someone doesn't like the story. What he will change is something in the game that is getting in the way of the person experiencing the story. And I think that's really important is like in taking that feedback is like, don't fundamentally change the thing, change it so they can experience the thing you want them to experience. That is one thing. 2, when it comes to feedback, and I guess this kind of relates to the Cory Barlog thing, either this is something that Tolkien, kind of like Tolkien's approach to intaking feedback, either takes it incredibly seriously to the point where like he will completely rewrite a chapter if somebody didn't like it, or he won't listen to feedback at all. And I think you can lose yourself in the middle trying to intake too much feedback. Because feedback, again, like I said, is important, but one of my favorite James Cameron quotes is when it comes to test screenings. He's like, test screenings are good, but they're a tool like a bandsaw. They can help you, but they can also cut your arm off if you're not careful. And so you either take the feedback seriously or just completely ignore it. Trying to pander to all pieces of feedback just dilutes what you're trying to make. It's like making a glass of orange juice and having 100 people tell you like how to actually make a better juice. And so you put a little bit of all of these people's favorite juices into a cup to try and make it better, and no one's going to like it. The third thing I will say, and this is kind of aligned with the second one, is don't just take feedback blindly. One of the things I do not on this podcast. I've talked about this in the past, I help out with a live storytelling show here in Toronto called Playlist Storytellers. I work with all of the storytellers to help them tell their stories and refine their stories for the show. And one of the things I tell every single one of these storytellers is like, I'm going to give you a bunch of notes right now. You could ignore all of them if you don't like them. Like how you intake feedback. Because I think one of the things artists, especially when it comes to like ego as an artist, and I get it, is like, you're telling me how to make my thing. And this is my thing. I know what I'm doing. I'm the artist, which is totally true. And that's part of the reason why people can like push back on feedback and notes and revisions. But one of the things is you don't have to take that feedback blindly. I think it's Neil Gaiman who says whenever somebody would read one of his books, like he stops listening. He's very intent on when they're telling him where they stumbled, like where it broke for them. But as soon as they try to start giving him solutions to the problem, he stops listening. Like people can tell you where it's broken. They cannot tell you how to fix it. And so one of the things as an artist you have to understand is like how you intake feedback and change your work is a creative decision that only you as the artist are capable of making. And so don't just take feedback blindly, figure out where it's broken, but then you as the artist have to figure out how to take that note and figure out how to fix it. Because this is your artwork and not somebody else's. Feedback is important. It's crucial to the process. Don't use it to change your message. Don't use it to change what you're trying to say, but intake it so that it can help you change how you're saying it just a little bit so that people are able to actually receive it. Editorial help is a good thing. That is not to say that the publisher or the editor always knows best. You as the artist have to have conviction in your idea. If you have a vision, you have to fight for it. Like, I'm actually going to read you this letter here that the author W. Somerset Maugham wrote. And this was about his time working with Fisher Unwin. This is something Stanley talked about when he worked with TFU. And W. Somerset Maugham said, Fisher Unwin pressed me to write another much longer book about the slums, which is what his first book was about, was living in the slums. He told me that was what the public wanted from me and prophesied that it would have, now that I had broken the ice, be a far greater success than Liza of Lambeth, his first book. But this was not in my ideas at all. I was ambitious. I had a feeling, I don't know where I got it, that you must not pursue a success, but fly from it. I was no longer interested in the slums once I had written a book about them, and I had indeed already finished a novel of a very different sort. Fisher Unwin must have been dismayed when he received it. There's a couple things in here that I want to pull out. One is this idea of, I had a feeling, I do not know where I got it, that you must not pursue a success, but fly from it. Couple of thoughts here. I think one, this idea of not pursuing a success is like doubling down on the thing that worked. I'm just going to do that again because that's what people want. Fly from it to me has a little bit of a connotation of like going too far away from the thing. Like you want to give people something new within a context they're familiar with, which is a difficult thing to do. But like, you don't want to just give them what they're asking for, but you also don't want to give them something completely irrelevant. Like the trick is you want to figure out how do you give people something they don't even know they want yet. And now when I read fly from it, I kind of get the idea like you're kind of going way too far in the opposite direction. So you don't want to give people what they want. You don't want to give people something they don't want. You have to find a way to give people something they don't even know they want yet. And one thing with publishers, not everybody is Stanley Unwin, right? Like most publishers see what works and they go, this made a lot of money. Let's do that again and make more money. The middlemen of culture are rarely imaginative. And if they were, they probably wouldn't be the middlemen of culture. And so the publisher does not always know what to publish. And so you as the artist, again, bringing it back to this idea of feedback, like this was the feedback that W. Somerset Maugham got, was like, just do another book like that again, was not something that he wanted to do. How you intake feedback is a decision that only you as the artist can make. And if you take in too much feedback to the point where you don't like the thing, you're not going to put all your heart and soul into making that thing. You're not going to put all your heart and soul into promoting that thing, which is important. And we're going to talk about that. You have to love this thing. And sometimes people will, again, coming back to these inflection points you're going to come to in your career, like you're going to come to a point where you're going to be promised a lot of money if you do a thing you don't want to do. And so the decision you're going to have to make is what's more important to you. Creating a body of work that is impressive, that you love, or making a lot of money. What's interesting though about this point is that The Lord of the Rings started as a publisher's request. Stanley Unwin was like, hey, The Hobbit did pretty well. Like, you should write a sequel. And so The Hobbit initially started as which ultimately did become a sequel in a sense, a spiritual successor, we'll say, to The Hobbit, is what The Lord of the Rings was. It wasn't like a straight up sequel of like, okay, I'm just going to write another story about Bilbo. Like, Tolkien didn't give them the Hobbit sequel that they asked for. But what Tolkien got from that request was kind of guardrails, or like a level of constraint that allowed him to write The Lord of the Rings, which I think is a big distinction, right? Like, I just think it's fun to like call this out of like one of the greatest books in history was written because a publisher asked for it. But again, Tolkien didn't give them The Hobbit. 2, he gave them The Lord of the Rings, which again isn't like a direct sequel. It is in a sense, but what it did was it gave Tolkien constraints. Because what Tolkien had been trying to write was the Silmarillion, which had no constraints. There were no rules. There were no guardrails. And he spent like 50 years writing it and never finished it. And so when Stanley Unwin said, hey, The Hobbit did quite well, like you should write a sequel, that gave him parameters to play with that allowed him to get to finish the book in a way that he was never able to do from the Silmarillion. But again, that's not, I wouldn't say that's a rule. That's more so the exception to the rule. Because oftentimes publishers, the middlemen of culture, learn the wrong lesson. Like Rainer Unwin talked about how with the success of The Lord of the Rings, they started to do some merchandising, some posters, some postcards, some calendars, and they put out like an annual Lord of the Rings calendar with like artwork, which was initially artwork by Tolkien himself and eventually became other people's interpretation of Lord of the Rings, but these like talented artists would do these calendars. And it was really successful for them. And they were like, oh, this calendar thing is working. We need to do another calendar. And so they put out a yoga calendar. And the yoga calendar was a complete and utter flop. Because the reason people liked the Lord of the Rings calendar isn't because it was a calendar. It was because it was a Lord of the Rings calendar. So sometimes publishers learn the wrong lesson. And that's something you as an artist are going to have to understand and navigate. And this doesn't mean that publishers are evil, right? Like, yes, they can be the bad guys. They can make bad decisions. They can be more money driven than is helpful, especially in the creative process. But sometimes publishers, producers, there should be a level like empathy, like don't treat them as adversarially, right? And that comes back to like the people you choose to work with. Like you want to choose partners in your process. Like a great example of this is James Cameron and John Landau, who is the producer of Avatar. John Landau was a producer. He was a middleman of culture, but he got it. And he supported James Cameron in a way that gave James Cameron, I mean, James Cameron, of course, like one of the top directors in the world, like he supported Cameron in his creative vision in a way that still had to make like business sense. But like these guys worked well together. But again, I think one thing, I don't want to villainize publishers and producers. Like I remember hearing one time, I was listening to an interview, or it was like a panel. It was Rick Jaffa, Amanda Silver, who were the co-writers of Avatar 2 and 3. And there was a producer on stage when I was talking. And this producer was talking about like he'd spent years trying to make a movie. And I heard that and I was like, oh. Like I'd, even like up to that point, I'd kind of been like, you just think of like the money people as like the bad guys in an artistic sense. But like these people aren't supporting, yes, they want to make money. And oftentimes so do artists. Like let's not kid ourselves here. But they're trying to make things that they also want to see in the world. They're supporting the artists who are making the thing. Yes, albeit sometimes they get in the way of the artist, of course. I'm not dumb. But they're also taking a risk. They're funding your dream, and they have vested interest in it. Like, again, this producer, he spent years, like a decade, trying to make a movie. Like, he loved this movie so much, the script, that he wanted to see it in the world. And he put up his own money and he spent his own time to try and get this thing made. that they're taking a risk, they're funding your dream, and it is their dream too. And that's why you don't want to just find a funder. You don't want to just find a manager. You want to find a partner who is going to support you in this journey. And the most important partner you're going to have is yourself. You have to be your own biggest supporter, mentally, spiritually, financially. You have to kind of put your money where your mouth is. Like Stanley cared about his business so much. He took all of the profits that they made every single year and he just put them back into the business. He even bought out a partner not because Stanley wanted to make more money. He bought out the partner, like in the long run. He bought out the partner because the partner came to him like, Stanley, we need to be taking more profits for ourselves. Like we're putting too much money back into the business. And to Stanley, that just didn't make any sense. And so he's like, if that's really what matters to you, I'm going to buy you out. I'm going to buy you out. I think he bought him out for more than his shares were worth. Because I can't afford to have a partner like that. We have to put everything back into the business. Stanley said to build a book publishing business, it is essential to plow back the profits. You need to invest in yourself. You need to invest the time, but you also need to invest the money. I think I talked about this in the past, but like, where are you spending your money? Look at where you put your money. Are you putting money towards chasing your dream? And if you're not, the question I have for you is how badly do you really want it? And I'm not saying like you have to be putting yourselves into debt and doing these things, but like if you look at where you're putting all of your money, how much of money that you can reasonably spend. I understand rent. I understand food. I understand these things. You do have like certain life stuff you got to pay for. I get it. But outside of that, of the money left over, what do you do with that money? Does that go towards supporting your dreams? Or does it go towards Uber Eats? How badly do you want it? Where you spend your money is showing you where your priorities are. And again, this trend that's like obviously coming up through the course of this episode is this idea of like find a partner, short-term cash can come at the expense of long-term cash. And what you want to do is you want to work with people with integrity who are going to help you make more money over the long run. Stanley told a story of one time he rang up the late David Roy, who was in the chief buyer for W.H. Smith & Son, to tell him that he had ordered too many of one of our books, and he gasped. Well, you are the first publisher to suggest that. It made him very attentive afterwards if I hinted that he had not bought enough, because as he said rightly, the publisher ought to know. Unfortunately, too many publishers are prone to maintaining that all their geese are swans, a mistake I resolutely refuse to make. Works of genius or outstanding saleability are too few and far between. And then Rayner also talked about in his memoir that sometimes Stanley would do the reverse, is instead of when a publisher bought too many, he'd be like, hey, you bought too many, like we're not going to send that much, we're not going to charge you as much. If a publisher didn't buy enough of a book that Stanley was really confident was going to sell well, he would send him copies that he could just return if they didn't sell. But if they did sell, then the bookseller would get the upside, but if they didn't sell, Stanley just ate the downside. He looked out for the people that he worked with. And so for you want to find somebody like that. You want to find people with integrity, but you also want to be somebody with integrity. Because of this, because Stanley worried less about the money in the short term. Like he didn't have to tell the chief buyer of W.H. Smith & Son that he bought too many books. Like he just been like, I'm not going to say anything because we're going to make more money. But even if that makes that decision once, that's going to prevent him from making even more money in the future. Versus that one decision to make less money up front allowed him to make more money in the future whenever he told David Roy to buy more copies because you're going to need them. And so he would. Because Stanley didn't focus on short-term success, it allowed him to have more long-term success. Just be somebody, just do, this is like advice for a 7-year-old, but just do the right thing. Be someone with integrity. Surround yourself with people with integrity, but also surround yourself with interesting people. And I think that's naturally going to be a byproduct for someone who is chasing the future, like Stanley was, like trying to find the book that people didn't want to just read today, but they also would want to read tomorrow is it's going to allow you to surround yourself with interesting people. He said one of the greatest joys of the kind of publishing I have attempted is the personal contact into which it brings one with really great people. My connection with C.F. Andrews and Selly Oak College brought me into association with Albert Schweitzer, whose lectures Christianity and the Religions of the World formed Volume 3 of the Selly Oak College series, which my firm published. To know Schweitzer is to love as well as to admire him. Oddly enough, my first conversation with him was due to his need of a haircut and his inability to describe in English his precise requirements. I offered to accompany him to act as his interpreter and to ensure that it was done in the way he wished. With that little incident, our friendship started, and I have been in touch with him ever since, and had the very great privilege of publishing his 2 volumes of autobiography memoirs of childhood and youth into my life and thought. And I have 2 lessons from this story that Stanley shares. And one is this idea of like, you want to surround yourself with interesting people. And a good like heuristic for your life is like, am I meeting interesting people on a regular basis? And if you're not, might be time to make some changes or to change the course that you are meeting people that you find interesting, right? It doesn't have to be interesting people to everyone, but like, are you meeting people on a regular basis that you find interesting? And the other side of that is like, do things that lead to fun stories. Like this is just a silly little thing of like, he accompanied Albert Schweitzer, who I'm assuming is German, but to get his haircut. Like that's just a funny little story. Like wouldn't have happened if he just gone back to the office. And like one of my beliefs is that the purpose of life is to collect interesting stories to tell. And so to use that as another heuristic of like when making decisions is, will this lead to a fun story or will it not? And one of the things like I even think about when it comes to Artwell and like the promotion of Artwell is I think the way I'm approaching it right now is too boring. Like I don't think the way I'm doing this show is going to lead to me having any interesting stories that come out of it. Like I'm going to be able to tell you stories and anecdotes about Tolkien, about Stanley Unwin, James Cameron, George Miller, whatever. But like I am not using this show as a vehicle to do interesting things and interesting things with interesting people yet. I think it will compound and get there, but that's one of the things I'm worried about. Like when you hear about people who are like young and scrappy, and even like a current example is like Creator Camp making this movie called Two Sleepy People. It's like an indie movie and they're like being super creative in how they're marketing and the way they're going about it. That's going to lead to fun stories. And I'm not like marketing or trying to get the show out in a way that's interesting. Like all of this occurs in this like little 550 square foot apartment that I live in. And so there's like no stories that are coming out of it. That's like one of my greatest worries with the show is like, I'm not leveraging it as a tool to have interesting stories. I'm slowly starting to meet interesting people as a result of it, but I'm not collecting enough stories because of it. And that's one thing I'm thinking from the long-term perspective, like how do I change that? And one of the interesting people that Stanley met over the course of his career was this guy named Thor Heyerdahl. And Thor was a Norwegian explorer who wrote the book The Kentucky Expedition, which became one of Allen and Unwin's best-selling books ever. It was published in 1948, and it was about Thor and his crew's expedition where they built a raft out of balsa trees and sailed across the Pacific on it. And so the book is about this experience. And Kentucky, like I said, was one of their best-selling books ever, outside of The Lord of the Rings, of course. And it's also an example of like how marketing was able to help amplify the book. Like when talking about this, Rayner said successful publishing all too often meant strident marketing. But I want to have a breakdown of how they marketed Kentucky. And this is a little bit long, but there's a few things in here that we're going to pull out and talk about. Our publicity in connection with the book, The Kentucky Expedition, was both diverse and interesting. First, I arranged with my good friend, the late Ralph Deacon, then foreign editor of The Times, that he should have the first serial use of material for an article about the book 6 weeks ahead of publication. This proved to be a magnificent piece of advanced publicity, which at once started people talking. Then we sold the serial rights to the Sunday Chronicle and later to the Liverpool Post and other papers. Almost double the normal number of view copies were sent out, and I wrote personal letters to many leading critics and editors. The Daily Mail chose it as their book of the month, thus ensuing still more publicity for us. During those final weeks before publication, we had been steadily feeding booksellers with facts about Kentucky, including the story of its striking success in Scandinavia, where over 140,000 copies had already been sold. With the help of a young architectural student, we had made models of the Kentucky raft for bookshop window display, and these proved immensely popular. We now heard that Thor Heyerdahl could be in London for the week prior to publication, and this at once opened up possibilities. He had already arranged to lecture to the Royal Anthropological Institute and to show again the silent film of the voyage, which had already been seen by the Royal Geographical Society on his earlier visit. This inspired us to hire a private cinema for a special showing to London booksellers. There is no doubt that this, coupled with the personal appearance of the author who provided a running commentary in excellent English, really brought home to booksellers the thrill and achievement of the expedition and the tremendous possibilities of the book. During that week, Philip Unwin, Stanley's nephew, arranged for Mr. Haredale to appear in a television program, and the largest of the raft models was also televised. We had already interested the BBC in a full-length feature program on the book, and the author was able to provide them at first hand with additional material. He was in fact an ideal author from his publisher's point of view. He was completely reliable and efficient, and he was extremely cooperative over all that we wanted him to do for the publicity of this book. As the only cinema available for his film would not seat more than 1/3 of those we wanted to invite, he generously agreed to lecture with the film twice on one evening, speaking continuously for nearly 4 hours, a feat of which he accomplished with no more than a plate of soup and a glass of beer for refreshment at halftime. He gave a third performance 2 days later. Okay, there's a lot to unpack from this, or you could say a quote, this passage of the book. The first one is like right at the top, and the first two are actually things you could probably skip over if you're not paying too close of attention. And before I actually even get into all these, I want to say if you are interested in this, but like marketing and what makes a book a bestseller, how to get your art out into the world, make sure you subscribe to the show, because the next deep dive I'm going to be doing is a shorter episode on this book called Bestsellers, Are They Born or Made? And it's from 1939. It's a book that Stanley actually co-wrote. And I learned about it. I went and read it and I summarized it. That's going to be the next deep dive that you're going to be getting. And really it's about like what actually makes a book a bestseller. And so I read it to find what still holds up from that book that is relevant today. And so if this part of the episode is interesting to you, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that. But the first thing, and again, this is something that's so super easy to skip over, is Stanley said that he arranged with his good friend, the late Ralph Deacon, who was then the foreign editor of the Times, that they should have the first serial use of material for an article about the book 6 weeks ahead of publication. And the part that I highlighted in my notes was 6 weeks ahead of publication. And there's two ideas around there. One is this idea of artists will make something, and I get it, I do the same thing. You make something, you get so excited about this thing that you made that you just want to put it in the world immediately. Like you're like, look at this thing I made, and you put it out there. But that can actually prevent people from seeing the work. And what you need to do is, one, you want to try to build some hype before it's out. Two, in order to do that, you're going to need to have a plan of how you want to put this thing into the world, how you want to market your art. And again, when you have the thing and you're just so excited and you put it out there, you're kind of scrambling after that, like, oh, I just gotta like post it on Instagram and do like, but what is the actual, like, what is the plan? How are you going to get your work out into the world? Take some time before you publish it to figure out that plan, how you're going to promote it, and get creative with it, right? Like, I'm not telling you to just make a plan that, like, don't treat this thing as something that you just have to do as like as a to-do list. Like, take some time to actually, but like an interesting way to do this, to try and get your work out there. Because really what you need, and this is the second thing that you could have potentially skipped over, is this idea, like Stanley said, that like this 6 weeks ahead of publication, this like serial use of the material in the Times started people talking. And because the most important thing for you as an artist, if you want to get your work out there, is you need word of mouth. You need people to be talking about it in a good way. Like, advertising can get people to try your work, but not for very long. Like, advertising can lead to a great first weekend at the box office, but it can't lead to a great second weekend without really positive word of mouth. Because if you get a bunch of people to the theater on the first weekend, they watch your movie and they go, wow, that's not good. They're going to tell their friends it's not good. And so their friends aren't going to go see it. And then their friends may even tell their other friends, like, oh, my friend told me the movie's really not good. And no amount of advertising is going to allow you to overcome bad word of mouth. And so you want to take time in advance before you release it, is how can you try to create just some level of word of mouth with the people you think would care about this? And one of the ways you're going to be able to do that is doing things that don't necessarily scale, right? Like when it comes to advertising, when it comes to promoting your work, we often think about it in the way of like, how can I get this in front of the most amount of people possible? But if we look at your situation, and I'm just assuming it's similar to my situation, where it's like you don't have the money to be advertising the way like other people are going to be able to do this. So what are other ways you're going to be able to stand out? And it's finding these unscalable ways. Because we got commitments. There's like, I'm just going to post on Instagram and like that could be seen by the entire world. Like, there we go. I'm promoting my work. But like, you're kind of just throwing it into the void. Like, what is something intentional you can do? And if we pay attention like to this long quote, Stanley said something that he did that wasn't scalable, but that made an outsized difference in people paying attention to this book. One, he said almost double the normal number of review copies were sent out. Cool. But along with that, Stanley said, I wrote personal letters to many leading critics and editors. Personal letters. That is going to make them pay attention, especially in today's world. Maybe not a DM, but if you're sending people letters, like I bet you if I sent some people that I wanted to listen to the show letters about Artwell, they would pay attention. And so what you want to do in this time where you're planning, this time in advance, is coming up with interesting ways to get people to actually pay attention to your show. It's not just coming up with the social content calendar, because that isn't necessarily going to find a way, isn't going to make your show necessarily stand out, or whatever your artist, I show, because I'm thinking of myself, but like whatever it is that you're doing, what is that like third door? What is that side door that you can go in that nobody else is paying attention to that will allow your work to stand out? And what's interesting is the people that Stanley was writing personal letters to were I was going to say the word influencers, but obviously that has a different connotation now, but like the influential people who are going to get a bunch of other people who respected their opinion, to talk about this book. And so he was not trying to write personal letters to the masses, but he was trying to find writing personal letters to people who had leverage to get more people to read it. And so in the moment when he's writing a personal letter to one person, that might not feel like it scales in the same way that like a full spread ad in a newspaper would, but it has the potential to scale if it goes well. Not every single one of those letters is going to have outsized results, but it just takes a couple of people to actually to be influenced by these letters, to have a positive, or to even just review this book, that then gets a lot of people to start paying attention. And so you, again, in that planning phase, figure out ways that you can stand out that other people aren't going to do. Another advantage here, and this kind of like ties all this together, because again, I kind of assume you're at a very similar stage to I'm at, where it's like you are responsible for everything, like you're making the thing, but you also have to promote the thing. And so maybe you're a little bit more advanced and you do have a team of people who's helping you, which is great. But like one of the most important things here is that Thor Heyerdahl, the author of the Kentucky Expedition, made himself available and he was reliable to his publisher. It's important that you as the artist buy into promoting your work. And Rayner said in his book that this is one of the first times an author has ever bought in to the extent that Thor did to actually promoting their work. Because people, yes, buy books, but people buy from people. People don't buy from books. And so if you as the author can actually be out there, not selling it, but like telling people why they should buy it, being a part of the marketing process, I think is so incredibly important, especially because the first touch point someone has with your work, whether it is a book or a movie or a podcast, is how you advertise it. That sets the tone for how they're going to experience your work when they actually sit down to consume it. And so you as the artist should want to be involved in the marketing, because that is going to shape how people experience your story. It is a part of the story itself. And so you as the artist need to be an integral part of the promotion of your art. Now, the catch is you can plan. You can have a great plan. You can, write these personal letters. You can have word of mouth. You can be promoting it, but you also need a great book. And I guess really you won't have word of mouth without a great book, but like you need all of this and a great book. Like advertising, promotion, marketing only works if you have something great to promote. You can't advertise a bad book into being a bestseller over a sustained period of time. Advertising works best when you have a great book to promote, when you have a great piece of art. So don't just think you can advertise your way to making something great, to getting a lot of attention over a sustained period. You need to have something great to promote. The best marketing strategy is a great piece of art. I used to work in sports. The best piece of marketing is a winning team. I worked for a hockey team for 2 seasons. The first season, they weren't very good. We weren't getting a lot of attendance. Our social numbers weren't great. The next year, they became the best team in the league. We made some big trades. We were winning a lot. We were in the playoffs. We were selling out the arena. We were having this was not NHL, it was OHL. We were doing 2,500 seats a game the first year. At the end of the second year, we were doing 9,000 seats a game. That was because we had a great team to promote. The marketing strategy wasn't overly different year 1 to year 2. Obviously, there were some improvements, but the big change was we had a great team to promote and people paid attention. So you can have the greatest marketing in the world, but if you're advertising a bad piece of art, no one's going to pay attention. And here's how Stanley explains it. The fact is that just as whipping will maintain and even accelerate the speed of a top that is already spinning, but will achieve nothing with one that is lying dormant on the ground, so advertising will maintain and even accelerate the sales of a book which is already being talked about, but will do little or nothing for one in which there is otherwise no interest. When we are told that a book has sold so well because it was advertised, it would almost certainly be true to say that it was extensively advertised because it was selling so well. So what he's saying here with this quote is if you have a top that's spinning and you flick it, it's going to get faster. But if that top is lying on its side, if the book is a book that no one likes, no one cares about, no one is talking about, you can flick that top, you can advertise that book, and that top all of a sudden isn't going to stand up properly and start spinning quickly. You can't advertise your way into a bestseller that is going to last. Again, you can advertise to get some initial movement on the book, but if that book is not good, if people are not talking about it, no amount of advertising is going to change that. You're just going to make more people aware of a book that they don't want to read. And advertising certainly isn't going to help people pick up a book if the book itself does not look enticing. How you package your book also matters. People say you can't judge a book by its cover, which is true. You can't look at the cover of a book and tell someone exactly what it's about and what your thoughts on that book in totality are. However, the cover of the book can entice you enough to pick up that book and start reading it. And when it came to titling the Kentucky Expedition, booksellers were telling Stanley he couldn't call it that. He had to call it something more obvious, like Across the Pacific on a Raft. But Stanley pushed back on it. He said, we're not calling the book Across the Pacific on the Raft. The word Kentucky would be within a few months a household word. And booksellers were, the way Stanley described them, incredulous. They did not believe him that that was the case. But Stanley had conviction in the title, The Kentucky Expedition. He said it made him think about this advice he got once from Sir Ernest Hodder Williams, who said, listen carefully what travelers have to tell you and then do the opposite. I actually think that calling it listen carefully to what travelers have to tell you and then do the opposite is interesting because I think travelers is actually people you should listen to. You don't want to listen to the vacationers, right? The people who are there doing the safe thing, the thing that everybody else does. That's what a vacationer does. They follow the path that was laid out for them by so many people. But a traveler goes off the beaten path. And so actually maybe you should listen to travelers. But this quote I think holds up if we just swap it to listen carefully what vacationers have to tell you and then do the opposite. Don't take advice from people who are only playing it safe. Because how you package your book matters. It helps tell the story, right? Across the Pacific on a Raft is a bit too obvious. The Kentucky Expedition, there's some mystique there. There's something interesting. And if you couple that with an interesting cover, that is what's going to get people when they're in the bookstore to pick it up, flip through some pages and consider reading that book. Another example of this, so I mentioned how I'm going to be doing an episode coming up on the book Bestsellers, Are They Born or Made, that Stanley co-wrote. And this is actually a passage of that book that I cut from the episode, but I thought fit really well right here. This isn't actually written by Stanley. This is written by a different book publisher, but I think it's helpful to include here to demonstrate the importance of titling a book. I will say for this next quote, it's more so referencing self-help books, but I have what Alan Unwin's titling rule became for non-self-help books, for storybooks. But this is the quote from Bestsellers, Are They Born or Made? The title of a book alone can sometimes be effective. Live Alone and Like It by Marjorie Hillis undoubtedly got its start from the title. The fact that it would not have smelled as sweet by any other name is borne out by the evidence that the manuscript was originally called The Problem of the Single Woman and was turned down by another publisher before Bobbs Merrill published it as Live Alone and Like It. Here was a title with sex appeal. Certainly some department stores thought so. They used the phrases as a heading for large ads and sold other merchandise on the strength of it. Life Begins at 40 by Walter B. Pitkin was another self-starting title. One look at the jacket in a bookstore window was all that was needed to sell it to the customers over 40. And again, this titling advice from Bestsellers Are They Born or Made really is for self-help books. You think of really what the punchline here of what this advice is like. When you're titling your self-help book, you want it to be titled around the outcome that the person who reads it wants to achieve. That is what's going to draw them in, right? Live alone and like it. I want to live alone and like it. Life begins at 40, right? It's for somebody who's feeling like life is over as they hit middle age. And this book is giving them a solution to that. Another example, like more contemporary example of this, is The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss. You see that title, you want to have a work week that only takes 4 hours so you can have freedom and all of these things. You're going to read that book. And what's interesting too is like especially when it comes to self-help, like I understand sometimes with a fiction story that you're writing, like you can be more romantic about the title. But here it's like, don't be afraid of testing it. Like when it came to The 4-Hour Workweek, I remember Tim Ferriss tested hundreds and hundreds of titles for his book until they found one that stuck. Like don't fall in love with the first title you write down. You need to look at, again, to bring it into the YouTube world, the biggest YouTubers in the world come up with hundreds of titles for a single video to try and get to the best one. So many people will come up with the first idea they'll stick to the first idea they had for the name. But the name is so critical. How you title your work, whether it be an album, a YouTube video, a book, is going to impact how people perceive it and whether or not they want to read it. This was for more self-help books, but how should you think about titling a book that's not self-help, where you're not just selling the outcome that the book is going to get you? And Rainer Unwin actually wrote this in his memoir of George Allen Unwin, that they had a theory about how they should be titling books. And that theory was that you should have 5 words in the title with an intriguing but arcane meaning. So it's unclear what it's about, but the title invokes some interest, some intrigue. And the examples that he cited was 2 Eggs on My Plate by Reed Olson, Blind White Fish in Persia. And so 2 Eggs on My Plate was about a espionage mission in Norway during the Second World War. Blind White Fish in Persia, which was about a small expedition of some Oxford University professors who went down to Persia. And of course, The Lord of the Rings. 5 words, arcane meaning, but invokes interest or intrigue from the person who reads it. That was one of the ways that Allen and Unwin thought about titling their books. The truth about a publisher, 5 words, a little bit more on the head, but it still generates that intrigue from the person who reads it. And that is one of the things that even you see that today, right? To bring it back to begin, is like invokes intrigue from the person who reads it, from the viewer, is critical to getting people to click. And this is how they were titling books back in the 1960s, the 1970s. Now, they had this rule, but that doesn't mean every single book had to fit that rule. Just because you have these rules or these structures that you put in place doesn't mean you should follow them blindly. Everything should run downstream from your art. You want to package your art in the best way for that piece of art. The Kentucky expedition does not follow the rules that Rainer laid out here of it should be 5 words, arcane meaning, but intriguing title. The Kentucky expedition, if you count Kentucky as one word because it's hyphenated, is just 3 words. Stanley had conviction in that title. He wasn't going to change it to Across the Pacific on a Raft. He believed in that title, and that was the best way to title that book. And he was right. The Kentucky Expedition, again, outside of The Lord of the Rings, is one of the best-selling books that Allen and Unwin ever had. And the success of the Kentucky Expedition actually articulates a point I was trying to make earlier in a much better way. When I was talking about Eric Ledbetter, the author who had 3 books that Allen and Unwin signed with a different publisher and rushed his book out, his 4th book out, and because he rushed it, it wasn't very good, so it didn't sell very well, which probably negatively impacted the long-term success he was going to have, because he probably shrunk his audience size by putting out a bad book, and then which naturally probably curbed the interest in his catalog. And I said that part of the lesson there was that you want to respect your success and make the most of it, but you don't want to take advantage of your success, which I think is true. But I think this articulation here is much better, where you want to move quickly once you have success, but you don't want to move on quickly to the next success. I think that's what Eric Ledbetter tried to do. He had the initial success from his 3rd book, and he tried to move on quickly to the next one to to take advantage of the fact that he had that success. Versus what they did with Kentucky was the complete opposite. They did put out some other books eventually, but what they did instead was they were going to try and just extend the success of Kentucky as long as possible. And Stanley said, as a matter of fact, like their perpetual anxiety was to ensure a sufficient supply of paper to print the book. They didn't want to run out of books because there is nothing which so effectively curbs the sale of a bestseller as frequent periods of being unobtainable. The interest in it can evaporate so rapidly. I was determined that Kentucky should never be out of stock for a day, and it never was. And that is more than could be said for any other recent bestseller. But it was not achieved without colossal effort and much faith. And so they were really pushing for Kentucky to remain on the shelves. They didn't want interest in it to wane. They were trying to again, they were moving quickly. They weren't resting on their laurels once they had the success. They weren't anticipating that, oh, if people want Kentucky, even if it comes off the shelves for a little bit, like that's fine. They'll be interested again when we put it back out there. They didn't want to test that. They were going to move quickly. They were going to make the most of the fact that they had a successful book, and how could they keep that book as successful for as long as they possibly could. They weren't like, let's get the sequel out immediately and that's what's going to extend the life of our success. They're like, no, people are interested in this thing. Let's do the most we can with it before moving on to the next thing. And there's it's a very difficult balancing act here because you don't want to be milking this thing, but they were just trying to make sure that they were able to fulfill public demand about Kentucky. And as a result of this, right, because they were trying to make sure that they could keep having the book available. They were moving quickly. They were looking ahead on how do we maximize the success of the Kentucky expedition. It actually became a bestseller 2 years in a row. It sold even better the second Christmas that it was out than the first one, which didn't happen very often. And the reason that it was able to do that it sold even more, was because the year's bestseller, the year after the Kentucky expedition came out, so I believe it came out in 1948, the Christmas of 1949, the best-selling book of that year ran out of copies. As a result, everyone then went and bought the Kentucky expedition. Do everything in your power to make the most on the success that you have. Do not move on quickly to the next success. Make the most of it. Go and do the next thing. I think part of the fear with that is this fear of being forgotten, right? Like, I'm going to put this thing there. Everyone's going to love it. I'm not going to put anything else out. And I think there's a balancing act here, again, right? Of don't rush it, because if you rush it, you're not going to put something out that the audience is hoping for. Don't wait so long that they forget you. And there's somewhere in the middle there. But the thing is, you want to make sure that people can delightfully rediscover you. You do not want to become a commodity. I talked about this example in the past, but I even mentioned God of War earlier in this episode. The God of War video games, again, I mentioned all these consoles that they were really, really good on, that they were some of the best games ever made. And I think I said 4 consoles. It was actually 5. They put out a game. Initially, it was every 3 years, and then it became every 5 years. And as a result, they were able to put the time in to make the most of it. Once the game comes out, they do everything they can with it. They push it for a long time. It becomes a whole year-long thing. And then they go away and they work hard on the next thing and they put it back out. The fans go, oh, God of War again. They get excited for the next game. Call of Duty is the inverse of that. Call of Duty puts out a game every single year. The Call of Duty average rating on Metacritic pretty much is starting to go down also every single year. Call of Duty has become a commodity. They haven't had the time they don't have the time to put in to truly foster and build on the success that they had, because they were trying to just get the next thing out to make the most money. And to be fair, they keep making money. And if that's your aim, if that's all you want to accomplish, go for it. Put as much out there as you can to try and make as much money as possible. But from a legacy standpoint, from a body of work standpoint, which I think is an incredibly important thing to do as an artist, have a great body of work, Call of Duty is hurting themselves by putting out another game every single year. It's better to be delightfully rediscovered than to become a commodity. And part of the reason sometimes that people do push, especially if you look at publishers who push their authors who are successful to get another book out and another book out, it's because that author being a bestseller is a critical part of the business's success. And outside of this author being a bestseller, they have a lot of, I don't use the word duds, but like a lot of books that aren't selling as well. And so they need this author to put out another book so they can hit their financial goals, whatever it might be. But when it came to Allen and Unwin, one of Stanley's core philosophies was that bestsellers should not make or break your business. Because a lot of publishers, they treat books the same way that an investor treats companies. They're going to invest in 10, 15, 20 companies. Most of them are going to go bankrupt. They're going to lose all their money, but one or two of the companies that they invest in are going to become unicorns. They're going to be valued over $1 billion, and that is when they're going to get their return and they're going to make their money. And it's going to be such a great return that it covers all of the failures that they had along the way. Publishers treat books in the exact same way. They're going to publish 50 books. 2, maybe 3 of them are going to do really, really well. So well that's going to cover all of the losses they had for all of their other books. Stanley, while he can recognize that, didn't think that that was the way in which he should structure his business. As a matter of fact, for him, having a bestseller should not make or break the company. He treated bestsellers as a bonus, not as something that they needed to survive. And when it came to the success of Kentucky, a competitor came to him once and he said that, it's easy to show profits when you have a bestseller as big as Kentucky. Like, obviously the company's doing well. Look at this book you published. And so what Stanley did is he said, I'm going to read you this quote. I accepted my competitor's challenge and instructed our accountants to prepare a fresh set of accounts, excluding Kentucky, completely from both sides, from, income and also from expenses. It was pleasant to find that the profits were within a few £100 of what they had been the previous year. That is as it should be, because years may pass without a bestseller coming a publisher's way, and I do not believe that the best type of publishing can be maintained in dependence upon such an uncertainty. Bestsellers are an uncertainty because you can't advertise your way to them. If you could advertise your way to a bestseller, there'd be a lot more bestsellers. But bestsellers are not a guarantee. And so Stanley, again, we look at like the bigger picture of how he ran his business. Quality of work was incredibly important to Stanley. And so therefore he was not going to rush his authors to put out the sequel to a book that did really well immediately so that he can make more money. We can look at how he treated the relationship with J.R.R. Tolkien, which truthfully ultimately ended up becoming a relationship that like Rayner truly maintained. But J.R.R. Tolkien published The Hobbit in 1938. They published The Fellowship of the Ring, the first Lord of the Rings book, in 1954. They published some like little one-off things in between, but like the big book that they were waiting for was The Lord of the Rings. And well, of course, there was maybe a little bit of impatience, but you can understand it took over a decade. They gave him the time to just do that. And even at that stage, Tolkien left Allen and Unwin, tried to publish his book somewhere else, came back, and then published it with Allen and Unwin. And they took it then because they realized the quality of the work. For Stanley, it was always about the quality of the work. And as a result, he wanted to run his business in a way that would create an environment where his best authors could do their best work. And that was not pushing for bestsellers. It was trying to create a business that was profitable without a bestseller. So that when one came, it would be a bonus, not necessary for survival, because it was bestsellers are an uncertainty, which I think is also an important lesson for you to recognize as an artist. I feel like so many people try to create things in a world where it's like, once I make it, then everything's going to make sense. Like my life will be in order. Like once I have the money, all these things coming in from making the thing. But it's like, how can you set your life up now that if you are to quote unquote make it, or if you are to quote unquote like make it big, you're already in a place now where it's like that just becomes a bonus. You're not putting yourself in a position where either you're going to make it or like life's going to suck. Try to create the life now where you can make the things in the way that you want to make them and have fun doing that. Like don't put your happiness, don't put your success in a bestseller, which is how Stanley ran his business. He wasn't going to put his company in a position where if there wasn't going to be a bestseller, they were going to have to shut the company down because it's such an uncertainty. What is the consistent thing you can do every single day, every single year to keep that company afloat? And truthfully, I think that makes a better business overall. It makes it a more sustainable business when you do it in that way. because a bestseller can mask problems in your business. And we're going to talk about that before we wrap up later today. But one thing I do want to address too, which I think is interesting, is I talked about how Rayner was like the true steward of the relationship with Tolkien. And if we look at the history of George Allen and Unwin, every single like core figurehead at that company had a relationship with like a critical author for the company that they maintained. Even before Stanley owned the company, George Allen had John Ruskin, who was like a famous author in the 1800s. Stanley had Bertrand Russell. That was like his core relationship. Philip Unwin, who was Rayner's cousin, Stanley's nephew. While Stanley published all of these books, I mean, other than Ruskin, the Thor Heyerdahl book, Kentucky Expedition, like that was really a relationship stewarded by Philip Unwin. And then Rayner really ended up stewarding the relationship with J.R.R. Tolkien. I just think it's interesting that over the course of the history, like each core person in the company had a key relationship with the firm's most important author. But again, just because they had these really talented authors who sold really, really well at their company does not mean that they relied on them to keep the company afloat. Stanley's belief was always you cannot maintain a fire with a single piece of coal. And this is why he didn't chase after bestsellers, because one, it was unpredictable. You didn't know when you were going to have a bestseller. And if you chased other authors who you thought were going to sell really well, that were going to have bestsellers, like poaching them from other firms, that was also a unsustainable business model, not only from the uncertainty perspective, but if you, let's say he did find an author that he really liked from another firm that had sold really well in the past, he outbids that firm, even though it's something he wasn't going to do, he outbids that firm, he brings that author over, they have the bestseller, thankfully, and then what? All of the other books are with his competitors. Books sell books. So when an author would have a book that would sell really well, people would go back and they'd want to read their other books. And so therefore, they wouldn't be going to George Allen and Unwin for those books. They would be going to his competitor and buying the back catalog. And so it's unsustainable to have an author come and write one book for you. You ideally want to have a relationship that lasts over time, because every single additional book that they are going to publish that does well is going to lead to not only more sales of that book, but of all of the other books. And so that was Stanley's philosophy. You cannot maintain a fire with a single piece of coal. That was one, of course, like just with banking on bestsellers, but also in terms of like how he built his book list. He wanted to make sure he maintained relationships with authors over extended periods of time, because that is going to lead to a consistent form of income as opposed to these like one-off flashes in the pan and chasing bestsellers. But this idea of books selling books is actually really interesting. Because another idea that Stanley did, or one thing that Stanley did that some people might have thought was interesting, was he would find one book on a subject that was really well written and he would publish it. And then he would find another book on the subject, which some might think is a competing book, and he would also publish that one. And he said if a publisher or if a competing book is offered to a publisher on a subject in which he has specialized, his own author, if consulted, would in many cases want him to decline the competing book without moment's hesitation. If the book is definitely not so good as the one already published, the advice is of course sound. So if the book that you're considering publishing is not as good as the one your own author has published, then why would you publish it? But what if the book is as good or perhaps rather better? Again, most authors would want it turned down, but in that case, they would probably be wrong. There are advantages in a publisher having all the best books on a subject in which he has specialized. In the hands of another publisher, the second book would indeed be a competitor. If both are handled by the same firm, each can be made to advertise the other, and both will benefit. The extent to which books in the same category or class can be made to advertise each other is seldom realized by authors and not always by publishers. I love that point. Art is not a zero-sum game. Somebody else's success does not mean that you don't get to be successful. In fact, somebody else's success could contribute to your success. Because when it comes to art, people don't just consume one thing. They don't just watch one movie and that's it. They don't just listen to one album. They don't just read one book. They watch a movie, they read a book, they listen to an album, and then they look for the next thing. Like if somebody watches one movie and they're trying to figure out what to watch next, they're just going to follow their interests. And so if you have something that's a similar topic to somebody else, there's a good chance that people are going to funnel from there to your art. And in Stanley's case, if he had the benefit of having both authors who published similar books, he could funnel them back and forth between each book, because if someone reads a self-help book, they're not just going to read one. They like to read self-help books, so they're going to read another one. And so if Stanley could make it easier for them to figure out what to read next by having the next book they should read just coincidentally mentioned at the end of the book they just finished reading, there's a good chance that they're going to go and read that thing. And so that's why Stanley said it was beneficial for him to have two authors who one could say have like competing books, because he could actually benefit each of those authors with each other. Now, in the case of Stanley, with his book, he didn't actually mention another author's book. He actually mentioned another book that he wrote. So he had two other books that he wrote. This is The Truth About a Publisher. And on the back of that book, he talks about the truth about publishing, which is kind of a textbook about the publishing industry, and Two Young Men See the World, which is about a world trip that he did with a friend of his. And he was using his current book to promote his back catalog, because again, similarly to if somebody reads a book that on one topic and then they see a book on a similar topic, they might go read that book. If they also liked this author enough and they see the author has other books, they're going to go and read that author's books. Like you see this time and time again, where it's like a movie comes out, does really, really well, and then the rest of that director's movies start to do well as well, whether it be streaming or they start to sell more. An artist puts out an album, all of their past albums spike in sales the same week as their new album, because people are reminded about them. People really like that new album, so they want to get more music. And so your back catalog, your back catalog moves and benefits from your new work. But the thing is, the back catalog doesn't move without a good present catalog. Like, people aren't going to go and read your back catalog if what you have put out, the new thing, isn't very good. Like we talked about Eric Ledbetter. He rushed his fourth book. It didn't do very well. That's not going to encourage people to go and read his old stuff. And so that's why quality always matters. That's why you don't want to rush to your next success. The best marketing for your old work is your new work, if your new work is good. Rayner said, I suppose that having been brought up to venerate the backlist, I found it difficult to see the need for any radical change, of course. Yet even then it was becoming plain that only with a strong front list will a backlist continue to sell. You need good things out there now in order to intrigue people about what you've put out in the past. That is why, even though there aren't many people who listen to this show, I'm going to put as much effort as I put into it every single time. Because I want the next thing I put out to be so good that you go back and you consume the old stuff. And I want the old stuff to be so good that you're going to consume the first thing and be like, wow, this was good. I actually want to listen to something else. You're going to go listen to the next thing and you'll be like, wow, this is good too. And that's going to be good enough that you want to continue going back through the catalog. And my opinion is always that your diehard fans are made in your back catalog. But in order to get people to go through it, you have to put something out that's so good that they want more from you. And the more that they're going to get from you is not you rushing the next thing that's going to disappoint them. It's going to be the thing that you've already put out that's of a certain quality that is going to bring them into your world and make them want to stay there. And that is what Stanley Unwin did. He tried to create a list of books that was of a certain standard and a certain quality always. He didn't chase trends. He didn't chase bestsellers. He just consistently did the best thing he could, put out the best work he could, and he became successful. And I want to talk about Stanley's success. And like, obviously this is what he did to become successful. Like, this was the craft, but what about just like the input of the individual, right? Like I guess I want to talk about like the work it takes to actually build something like this, like what it takes to be successful. This book list is a critical part of it, but the work that is required. Because he did this for decades. That isn't luck. That takes work. And so this is Stanley on what it takes to be successful as a publisher. Whether it be profession, trade, or craft, publishing is certainly exacting. It is a most jealous taskmistress. It is more than what is known as a full-time occupation, because that is limited to office hours. The building up of a successful publishing business involves working non-stop and almost taking it to bed with one. For my own part, except for tennis on Saturday and Sunday afternoons and during holidays when I shut myself off entirely from the business, I have for years on end worked non-stop and thrived on it. Even the reference to taking it to bed with me is not a complete exaggeration, because I have often employed the unconscious to solve problems for me while I slept. What he's talking about with that, the last part of that quote, is like when he would go to bed, he would think about like the biggest problem that he was having and just let his unconscious work on it while he slept, so that when he woke up, he would have a solution to whatever the problem was. But the real takeaway from that quote is just the obsession that it took to become such a great book publisher. Like, Stanley was all in on book publishing. He didn't have a foot in cabinet making and a foot in book publishing. He was focused on one thing and one thing only. And if you want to become great, that is what it takes. You have to be obsessed with it. Always thinking about ways to improve it, ways to make it better. How could my story be better? How can I become better at what I do? Like, you have to be on this constant journey of getting better and improving. And it doesn't end at any point. You don't reach a point, like Stanley never reached a point where he was like, this is it. I know everything. I know everything there is about book publishing. I can just coast now. The journey doesn't stop. Like, you have to be all in forever. Like he said, my experience of book publishing is that people tend to embark upon it with their eyes half closed and to open them very wide when they subsequently discover what it really involves. The knowledge that is needed for success in publishing cannot be acquired in a day, nor yet in a year. It is often not until after a wide experience of 10 or 15 years that a publisher realizes most keenly how much there is still to learn. After a decade, after 1.5 decades, it's not just like, oh, I know a few things that I need to get better at. But the way he frames it, like how much there is still to learn. Like, eventually you get to a point where you know so much that you realize you actually know nothing. It's like George Miller talking about how he studied storytelling his entire life. He could study storytelling for another 1,000 years and he still wouldn't know everything. That can be a little bit daunting when you're just starting out. It should be a little daunting, but it also should be exciting, because that means you get to do this thing forever and you'll never get bored of it. And I guess it's an important heuristic too, like if as you go through your career, you start to get bored of your art, it's because you've settled with your art and you're not pushing yourself and constantly learning, because there is never going to reach a point where you know everything, where there's nothing left to learn. It might take a little bit more work to uncover those things, but if you get to a point where you aren't learning new things, it means you are coasting. You've settled in your work. And you may be thinking, like, this is my art though. I don't think it should feel like work. But we talked about this in the Tolkien episode, that just because you love something doesn't mean it isn't hard work. But because you love it, it is going to make the hard work worth it. Book publishing for Stanley Unwin was a grind. He loved it, but he worked hard. He was asked once, if publishing is such a tribulation, why bother with it? When that question is put to me, I answer with another. Does a mother cease to love the child who tries her? Does she not love him the more? Publishing is my child, and no trials or tribulations will make me cease to love it. I think the way to think about it is like, there might be days where you don't like your art, but you should always love your art. It's going to be hard work. Of course it is. It should be. But that doesn't mean it's not worth it. The hard work, when you love it, is worth it. If you love it, you're going to keep going when the work gets hard, when other people will give up. And you think about sometimes where people are like, once I become successful, I can start outsourcing things. But the thing to remember is, as you continue to have success and opportunities come your way, don't outsource the things you love in the pursuit of growth. I use YouTube as an example a lot because I spent a large portion of my early to mid 20s in the YouTube world. I myself was never a successful YouTuber, but I was around a lot of successful YouTubers. And I always was not, what's the word I'm looking for? I always made me sad when you would see a YouTuber in pursuit of growth start bringing on these people to their team. That meant that they didn't get to actually do the thing that was like making the videos anymore. Like, they fell in love with YouTube because they wanted to make videos. But then they got to a point where there was so much logistical overhead and the business had bloated to a certain point where it's like they couldn't just make videos anymore. They had to run a business. But that's not why they started in the first place. And we get so obsessed with growth that we end up like outsourcing the things that matter most to us. And there's one time Casey Neistat was at a YouTube conference and this guy came up and this guy was interviewing him. And he was like, at what point do you hire an editor? And Casey was like, why would I ever hire an editor? Like the thing I love to do, I love to edit where the story is made is in the edit. That is the most important part of the whole process. Why would I ever hire an editor? And the interviewer like didn't understand what this, like neither of these guys understood each other's point of view. Like the guy who was interviewing him was like, well, the purpose of doing this is to grow bigger on YouTube. And Casey's like, well, the purpose of doing this is to make videos and I love making videos. And they like just didn't understand each other's worldview. And so you want to make sure that as you continue to grow, you don't do so at the detriment of the things you love to do. Stanley held on to the important parts of his business, even as it continued to scale. He said, day by day, I go personally through the pile of unsolicited manuscripts which descend upon us, still eagerly and optimistically hopeful that among the mass of rubbish there may be, if not a work of genius, something of outstanding interest. Stanley held on to the most important parts of his business. Sure, he had help going through the manuscripts. He wasn't going to personally read every single one, but he still would go through all of them because that is an integral part of his business. The selection of the books that they choose to publish was the business. And so Stanley held on to that. Another benefit of that too, right, is as you grow, if you start like removing yourself from the actual thing that you're doing, it makes you dull. Like not dull as in boring, but dull as in the opposite of sharp. By still doing that, by being in the trenches with your team, if you have a team, by being in the trenches, it keeps you sharp. Rayner, when talking about his dad, said, but by actually seeing every written order that came to the firm, this is different. So this isn't necessarily about the manuscripts now. This is about the orders that they were getting from bookstores. But Rayner said, by actually seeing every written order that came to the firm, my father was able to maintain an uncanny knowledge of what books sold where. In order to run his business in the best way, had to make sure he was still in the trenches. He was still actually doing the thing. Because if he removed himself from the actual process, he wouldn't know what was actually working and what wasn't. Actually doing the thing kept him sharp so he was able to continue making good decisions throughout his entire career. He didn't outsource somebody else to go through all of the orders. He didn't outsource to have somebody else go through the manuscripts. He still had his hands in these things. He kept a pulse on all of these things. When it comes to this podcast, like using myself as the example for something like this, people ask me all the time, how do you use AI in your research? Or does AI make your research so much faster? And AI truthfully doesn't make my research any faster because I don't use AI for my research. And this isn't just necessarily a commentary on AI. This is the same thing if I hire somebody else to do the research for me, if the show reached a scale where I could hire somebody. This show isn't as good if I don't do the research. Not because I think I am the best researcher on planet Earth, but because if by doing the research, I just know the material. Like this outline that I put together for each episode is like complicated and the flow, it's structured very intentionally based off of like what I know about the person and how I want to lay the information out. And I'm only able to do this because I can flow between points and I just know the information. If I'm just looking at somebody else's summary, like I'm not going to know the information in the same way. You don't want to, one, outsource parts of the process that you love. And I love the research too. Like part of the research process for me is like reading great books and watching great movies. Like I don't want to have somebody else do. Like part of the reason I do this show is because I like to watch these great pieces of work and then I want to talk about them. I also love being on the mic, but if you start stripping away all the other pieces and I'm just left talking about what somebody else watched and what somebody else found, it's not going to be as exciting for me. And so you don't want to outsource, one, the parts of the thing that you love for the sake of growth, because what's the point of growing if you're not going to enjoy doing it? And two, if you are growing, don't outsource the critical components that will make you a less effective operator. If you remove yourself from the process, your company, in this case we're covering a businessman, is going to struggle. like we talked about, when a visionary founder steps down or steps away, the company struggles because you are only as good as the person at the helm. And when a visionary founder steps down, it leaves a huge void to fill that in some instances, like, it's not even possible to fill because you could never be that person. Like in a lot of instances, big companies are the person who runs it. And yes, they can survive after that person steps away. I'm thinking of Apple right now. Like, yes, Apple has survived under Tim Cook, but it hasn't been the same as when it was ran by Steve Jobs. And this is a much smaller scale here, but when Stanley Unwin stepped down, Rayner stepped up, and the company just wasn't the same. And it's not necessarily me. I don't want this last portion of the book to be like a knock on Rayner Unwin. He ran a successful publishing company for over 20 years. He maintained the relationship with J.R.R. Tolkien and his estate. He is the reason why so much of Tolkien's work was published posthumously. So I don't want you to think about like Rayner is just like a completely incompetent operator and like he is the reason why this company failed. I don't want that to be the takeaway here because I don't think that is true. However, I think Stanley Unwin left a void that could not be properly filled. Rayner himself even acknowledged this. He said, the children of pioneers do not necessarily do well to follow closely in their father's footsteps. Often they stand in too much awe of the founder's formula for achieving success and are not sufficiently questioning about exploring alternatives. William Allen, who was George Allen's son, the original founder of the company, and I could both claim to have been insufficiently detached from the companies. And so he's acknowledging the fact that, like, look, he's one, not his father. He's also too close to it that he's just trying to do things in the way his father would do them, but he is not his father. He's not the visionary who built the company. And so but again, though, this decline happens over the course of multiple decades. And this isn't to necessarily say that had Stanley just been able to live 20 years longer, the company would have continued to thrive. Like Rayner even talks about the fact that around the end of his career, his dad had an unwillingness to change. He didn't like how the industry was changing and he didn't want to change with it. So Rayner, when reflecting on this, said what he, Stanley, did not accept easily was change. He deplored many of the trends that he saw happening around him within the book trade and instinctively blocked initiatives that might, to advantage, have modified archaic but hallowed practices within his own business. The instinctive conservatism of old age became a barrier to altering anything. Like one point they brought in a consultant and Stanley was like, I'm not listening to a consultant about how to run my business. Like, I've been doing this for over 50 years. I know what I'm doing. And it was kind of his attitude up until the point in which he retired. And so then the company passes to Rayner, and again, he runs it for like 20-ish years before it is ultimately acquired because they kind of fell into some financial hardship. And when I think about this, like sometimes legacy is just getting out of the game at the right time. It's like that famous quote from, is it The Dark Knight or The Dark Knight Rises, where it's like you either live long enough to see, you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a villain. Like George Allen Unwin was coming into a challenging 20-year period that Stanley in his old age might not have been suited to navigate anyways. Maybe a case could be made that younger Stanley Unwin, if you dropped him into 1970, he would have been suited to do it. But nonetheless, like what I'm saying, why I'm saying all of this is like, I just want to make it abundantly clear. Like, this is not just like Rayner Unwin wasn't good enough to run George Allen Unwin. That's why I got acquired. Like, there were some cracks that were starting to show even when Stanley was still running the company, and Rayner, again, wasn't the visionary founder. Maybe he didn't have the business acumen to navigate that, but it is not entirely his fault. But one of the things that masked or papered over a lot of the cracks that were starting to show was J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien did so well that they didn't react to the decline of the business fast enough. Like the lesson I just talked about, where you don't want to put, like, one coal isn't enough to maintain a fire. Like, you don't want to rely on the success of one author to keep your business afloat, was something that Stanley knew, but Rayner didn't necessarily take that lesson. Like even after all was said and done, after George Allen Unwin had merged with another company and then got acquired by HarperCollins, in his memoir of the time writing this book, George Allen Unwin, he has a very different takeaway than what Stanley had written in Truth About a Publisher, which I've already talked to you about can't maintain a fire with a single coal. And Rayner wrote this: "A publisher who has and can hold a consistently best-selling author on his list is fortunate indeed, and this heartbeat of success helps to ameliorate the financial drain that many worthy but less successful ventures often incur. Of course, a single author is not the only secret of a profitable company, but it certainly helps." It does help, absolutely. But like his father said, it is not something that you can bank on for the longevity of the company. The company needs to be successful separate from the bestseller. The bestseller should not be the reason the company is staying afloat. Now, Rayner, he does acknowledge this, but he also acknowledges the fact that it is unwise for a publisher to rely too heavily on a single author. George Allen Unwin, during its last decade, was blinded by the effortless success of Tolkien's books, which effectively obscured the stagnant and unprofitable nature of most of the rest of the trade list. I find it kind of interesting that in the same book, Rayner both acknowledges the fact that having a consistent author as a bestseller is super fortunate, but then he also acknowledges in the book that by doing that, by relying too much on Tolkien, that it papered over the cracks that were starting to form and didn't make them react quick enough to the decline of the company. And I think truthfully, like the merchandising of the Lord of the Rings, of the posters, the calendars, the postcards, like that should have been enough of like the alarm bells should have, I think they were going off at that point, truthfully, but they relied way too heavily on Tolkien. And the industry was changing. Like the industry that Stanley Unwin built the business in was not the same industry that Rayner Unwin took over. And here's him actually reflecting on kind of how things had started to change. He said it was very typical of the informal, almost casual publishing that was still possible during the 60s. Gradually thereafter, there seemed to be less scope for editorial indulgence. More books were being published every year, and competition in a fairly static market had become intense. The opinions of the finance and sales departments became more central to the actual publishing instead of being supplementary to an editor's decision. A derogatory phrase, the middle ground, began to be applied to titles that were neither specialist nor potential bestsellers, and might at best only cover their costs. The larger new groupings of publishing imprints that had outside financing were expected by their shareholders to pay an ever-increasing dividend. Consequently, break-even books were not even considered, and the editor's authority to choose was severely eroded. We were slow to recognize or adapt to this new trend, but after my father's death in 1968, and a few years later, the retirement first of Philip Unwin, his cousin, then of Malcolm Barnes and Charles Firth, important people at the company, we were weakened as far as editorial instinct was concerned. But because I insisted on retaining sole responsibility for authorizing new books for publication without overmuch reference to my finance or marketing directors, we began to experience the worst of both worlds. It was a slow and subtle change linked also to the inflationary pressures that were assailing the country and thus the book trade during the 70s. But it was the beginning of the end of an era. Perhaps it was symbolic that in our spring list of 1969, in which we commemorated Father's death, the lead title concerned the sinking of the Titanic. And so George Allen Unwin the business was set up for success in a bygone era and was unable to adapt to the changes of that new era, partially because of the fact that they had too successful of a bestseller to really force them to change appropriately. Like by the time they realized it was almost too late, and ultimately what ended up happening, they merged with another company before continuing to go through financial struggle and then being acquired by somebody else. And if we flash back to how Stanley bought George Allen Publishing, George Allen was a founder who ran his business and he ran it well, passed the company on to his kids. Company fell on financial hardship. They tried to merge with another publishing company. That didn't solve the problem. They were then acquired by Stanley Unwin. George Allen Unwin was built by Stanley Unwin. He then retires, hands the company over to his kid. He runs it. The company falls on financial hardship. They attempt to merge with another company. That doesn't solve the financial hardship. They are then acquired by HarperCollins. And in that acquisition, George Allen and Unwin essentially ceases to exist. They don't take a lot of books from their book list. They're taking, obviously, The Lord of the Rings, Roald Dahl's books. Actually, I think Roald Dahl's books were sold to somebody else, but most of the books didn't even come over. George Allen Unwin does technically still exist. There was an Australian arm of the company that was ultimately separate from the acquisition. So that still exists today in Australia. So there is some lineage of the company that does still exist. And also, while not directly related to the company, Merlin Unwin Books, Stanley's grandson, who did work at George Allen and Unwin, also continues to exist and operate today. And so really, if I'm to boil down in a very reductive way, what happened to George Allen and Unwin? Why did it cease to exist? Truthfully, it was built for success in one era and was unable to adapt to a new era as it was ushered in. One of the things that George Allen and Unwin was really good at in their time was being a generalist firm. They didn't have a niche. They didn't publish a specific genre. One of the things they prided themselves on was the fact that they published so many different kinds of books. But as they entered into this new era where companies got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they still remained a rather modest publishing firm, they didn't specialize in anything. They continued to be generalist. But the thing is, kind of like how we talked about earlier, where your greatest strength is on the flip side of your greatest weakness, you look for that as a way to differentiate yourself from the people who are more successful than you. Like Mr. Beast, in the back to that example, didn't try to go after bigger YouTubers competing on a money game that he couldn't play. Like, he found something that he was able to do that the bigger people, the bigger YouTubers weren't able to do. And for George Allen and Unwin, they were a very generalist publishing firm, but small, going up against big generalist publishing firms with huge, deep pockets. They were never going to win that game, trying to beat the bigger guy by doing the exact same thing they're doing at a smaller scale. They had to find their unique specialty and focus in on that. And one of the things where they could have potentially built a specialized book list was children's books. When reflecting on this, Rayner said, with the success of The Hobbit and then the lucky advent of Roald Dahl, I should suppose have concentrating on founding a children's list. But there were so few of us acquiring books, and our range was so great that, with trade books at least, we never became true specialists. Indeed, at the time, we felt this was our strength. Now, perhaps, we might feel it had been our weakness. And so he's able to reflect on this, and maybe there was something there. If they just double down, they become a children's book publisher. And while Rayner acknowledges this, it would feel quite speculative of me to come here and say that all George Allen and Unwin had to do to survive was to just become a high-quality children's book publisher. Because no matter which path they'd taken, if they went the path they did take, or they took this other path of becoming a specialized publisher, there was going to be pain. There was pain on the path they went down of keeping George Allen and Unwin the same, trying to run it in the same way, and then ultimately having to merge and get acquired, and people lost their jobs, and the company essentially dissolved. There was pain on that path. But also, had they tried to become this like specialist firm, there would have been a lot of pain that way too. There would have been huge restructuring of how the company is ran, the ethos of the company, how they approach publishing books. Everything would have changed. It ultimately could have ended up being a firm that was completely different other than the name. And so each path was going to be filled with difficulties and challenges. And so again, it feels quite speculative for me to say that. And so would George Allen and Unwin have been successful? Would it have continued to exist today had they become a children's book publisher? We'll never know. And maybe the case is that George Allen and Unwin was a product of its time and it is best left in that era. There's one thing I want to talk about before we wrap up this episode. And it's something that I just casually mentioned a second ago, but I haven't really addressed this entire episode. And it's the fact that George Allen and Unwin, in addition to publishing J.R.R. Tolkien, also published Roald Dahl, like two huge, giant titans of children's literature. And I guess the reason I didn't mention Roald Dahl up to this point is because Stanley Unwin didn't actually publish him. It was Rayner's decision to publish Roald Dahl. And I want to talk about why and how they ended up publishing his books. And so at the time, he had an American publisher. So his books were being published in the US, but he had no UK publisher. So there weren't really any UK editions available. But Roald Dahl's daughter was in the same class as Rayner Unwin's daughter. And one day, Rayner's daughter came home with 2 books. She came home with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and James and the Giant Peach. And she loved both of these books so much that Rayner reached out to Roald Dahl inquiring about publishing the UK editions of his books, which ultimately ended up happening. And what's so interesting about this is the way that they publish their 2 greatest children's authors ever are very similar. The reason they published The Hobbit was because Stanley Unwin asked his child to read the book, and his child loved the book so much that they published it. And the reason that Rayner Unwin published Roald Dahl is because his child loved his books so much that he decided to publish them. And when reflecting on this parallel, Rayner said this: Dahl, like Tolkien, has come to dominate the list of children's favorite reading now at the end of the century. Their successes have been astonishing and in many ways unpredictable. I was fortunate to have been exposed to both authors and to have been their publisher, but I could not claim that it was my good judgment as an editor that brought this about. It was the immediate enthusiasm of children in both cases that caused their first books to be published. Thank you so much for listening to my deep dive on Sir Stanley Unwin. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe. I've got lots coming your way on the podcast. Next, I'm going to be putting out a bonus content episode as an audio exclusive on all of the material I have on Stanley and Rayner Unwin that didn't make it into this deep dive. 2 weeks after that, I'm going to be putting out an episode on bestsellers, Are They Born or Made? The 1939 book that Stanley co-wrote about what actually makes a book a bestseller. And then after that, I'm going to be releasing my deep dive on Peter Jackson, the director of The Lord of the Rings. If you want to support the show, I have one simple ask for you. Just send this show to one friend who you think would like it too. And if you want even more Artwell, I have a challenge for you. Go and listen to an episode of somebody you've never heard of before. My belief is that Artwell works at its best when you can listen to any episode and get value from it. And now, go do your thing. And whatever it is, do it well.